There is a specific number that every family with more than one sibling eventually learns to fear, and it is not a number you will find printed anywhere, because it is different for every family, and it is calculated not in dollars, but in trust. It is the amount of money that, once lent and not repaid, transforms a relationship permanently, not gradually, not through a slow accumulation of resentment, but in a single identifiable moment when the unpaid amount stops being a loan and starts being a fact about who someone actually is. Most families never find that number because most families never lend enough to discover it. The Hartwell family found theirs at $80,000. Not because $80,000 was an amount any of them could not survive losing, though it was significant, and though losing it cost each of them something specific and personal that took years to fully calculate. They found the number because $80,000 was the amount it took for 4 separate people to finally stop believing a story they had been told, collectively and individually, for 11 years. The story was that Daniel Hartwell was a struggling entrepreneur who needed bridge funding for a business that was always one investment away from working. The truth, when it finally surfaced through a forensic trail that took a private investigator 6 weeks to construct, was something none of them had been prepared to consider. Because the alternative to believing your brother is unlucky is believing your brother has been lying to you with total confidence for over a decade. And that is a much harder thing to accept than bad luck. Welcome to Venom Thread. This is the story of what a family found when they finally stopped accepting the story and started asking for the paperwork. Daniel Hartwell was the middle of 3 children, 2 years younger than his sister Renee and 4 years older than his brother Marcus. He had been, by every account from their shared childhood, the most charismatic of the 3, quick with a joke, generous with his attention, the kind of person who made family gatherings feel lighter the moment he arrived. This charisma had served him well in adulthood in a way that had initially seemed like genuine promise. He had started 3 businesses by the time he was 35, a specialty coffee importing operation, a fitness technology startup, and most recently a renewable energy consulting practice. And each one had been described to the family, at its outset, with the same specific energy, detailed market analysis, a clear sense of competitive advantage, a timeline to profitability that always seemed plausible because Daniel was good at making plausible things sound inevitable. Each business had also, eventually, failed. Not dramatically, not through some single identifiable catastrophe that the family could point to and understand. They had each simply wound down over a period of months, with explanations that involved market conditions or partnership disputes or capital requirements that had been underestimated. The family had absorbed 3 business failures over 12 years with the specific generosity that families extend to a member they believe is talented but unlucky. They did not yet understand that talented but unlucky was a story, and that the story had a function. Renee Hartwell, the oldest sibling, was the first to lend Daniel money directly, 6 years before the events that would eventually unravel everything. The amount was $12,000, requested for what Daniel described as a bridge loan to cover a gap between a secured investment commitment and the actual transfer of funds. A gap, he explained, that was common in early-stage funding rounds and that he expected to close within 90 days. Renee had the money. She had built a successful career as a hospital administrator and had savings that made $12,000 a meaningful but not devastating sum to lend. She lent it because Daniel was her brother, and because the explanation made sense in the specific technical language that Daniel always used when discussing money. Language that sounded informed and current, and that Renee, who did not work in finance, had no independent basis to question. The 90 days passed. Daniel explained that the investment commitment had been delayed, not canceled, and that he expected resolution within another 60 days. The 60 days passed. The explanations continued, each one specific and plausible and slightly different from the one before, for the better part of a year, at which point Daniel made a partial repayment of $3,000. Explained as the first installment of a repayment plan he had structured around the consulting income he was now generating while he wound down the failed fitness technology venture and pursued new opportunities. The partial repayment mattered enormously to how the following years unfolded, because it functioned, whether Daniel intended it this way or not, as proof of good faith. He had paid something back. A person who pays something back is, in the specific psychology of family lending, presumed to intend to pay back everything eventually. Renee believed this for 5 more years. Marcus, the youngest, lent Daniel $18,000 across 3 separate occasions over the following 4 years, each request following the same pattern. A specific and plausible business need, a timeline for repayment that always felt reasonable in the moment it was presented, and partial or delayed repayment that reinforced rather than undermined the trust the family extended. Their parents, Robert and Carol Hartwell, contributed the largest single amounts, $22,000 from their retirement savings, given over 2 transfers that Daniel described as critical for securing the lease and initial inventory for the coffee importing business. Each family member who lent money did so somewhat independently, often without full knowledge of how much the others had already contributed, because Daniel had developed, whether through deliberate strategy or through the kind of intuitive social management that some people develop without ever consciously designing it, a habit of discussing his financial needs with each family member separately, in conversations that felt private and specific to that relationship rather than coordinated. This compartmentalization was the architecture that allowed the total amount to reach $80,000 over 11 years without any single family member fully understanding the scale of what the family, collectively, had given him. The compartmentalization began to break down not because of any single dramatic event, but because of an ordinary family conversation that happened to occur at a moment when the right 2 people were in the same room. Renee and Marcus were at their parents' house for a birthday dinner, in the kitchen together while their parents were occupied elsewhere, and the conversation drifted, as conversations between siblings sometimes do, into a casual comparison of recent financial pressures. Renee mentioned, lightly, that she was still waiting on Daniel to finish paying back the loan from years earlier, a comment she made without particular weight, simply as the kind of mild grievance siblings share. Marcus, surprised, asked what loan she meant, because he had assumed, based on conversations he had had with Daniel about his own loans, that Daniel's business challenges over the years had been funded primarily through Marcus's own contributions and some unspecified external financing. The conversation that followed, which both of them later described as having a specific and uncomfortable quality of mutual realization building in real time, revealed that each of them had been lending Daniel money for years without knowing the other was doing the same thing. They did not yet know about their parents' contributions. They did not yet know about the full pattern. But in that kitchen, on that evening, the first crack in 11 years of compartmentalized trust opened, and it opened because 2 people who loved the same person had simply never compared notes. What followed over the next several weeks was not a confrontation. It was something more careful and more methodical, driven primarily by Renee, who had the specific professional habit, developed through years of hospital administration, where documentation errors had real and serious consequences, of wanting complete information before drawing conclusions that would affect significant relationships. She began by asking her parents, gently and without alarm, whether they had ever lent Daniel money. Her mother's hesitation before answering told Renee almost everything before her mother said a word. Yes, her parents had lent money. Several times. The most recent contribution had been just 8 months earlier. Renee asked for the total. Her parents, to their own visible discomfort, had to think about it for a long moment before arriving at a number, because they had never added it up themselves. $22,000, they eventually calculated. Renee did not share her own figure yet. She wanted to understand the full scope before she decided what to do with the information, because she had already begun to suspect, in a part of her mind she was not yet ready to fully articulate, that the scope might be larger and more deliberate than any of them had allowed themselves to consider. The first twist arrived when Renee, having compiled the family's collective lending, $12,000 from herself, $18,000 from Marcus, $22,000 from their parents, totaling $52,000 across the contributions she knew about, decided to look more carefully at the actual businesses Daniel had supposedly built with this money. She had assumed, as had everyone else, that the businesses were real. Attempts that had genuinely failed. What she found through public business registration records, after several hours of searching that she conducted alone at her kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon, complicated this assumption in a way she had not anticipated. The coffee importing business had been registered as an LLC. It had filed for dissolution 2 years after registration, consistent with what Daniel had told the family. But the dissolution filing included a financial statement, a public document Renee had not known to look for until a friend in business law mentioned that dissolution filings sometimes required them. And that financial statement showed total business expenditures of approximately $14,000 across the company's entire operating life. $14,000. The family had contributed, by Renee's calculation, considerably more than $14,000 to that single business alone. Where had the rest of the money gone? If not into the business it had ostensibly been raised for. Renee did not confront Daniel with this discrepancy directly. She had learned enough, in the brief period of investigation she had already conducted, to understand that confronting Daniel with partial information would likely produce a plausible explanation that she would have no way to verify or refute, because that had been the pattern for 11 years, and there was no reason to expect it would change now that the stakes were higher rather than lower. Instead, she did something that none of her siblings or parents had considered. She hired a private investigator who specialized in financial background research, a woman named Patricia Nwosu, who had previously done similar work for a hospital colleague navigating an elder financial abuse situation within her own family. Renee paid for this herself, did not tell her parents or Marcus she had done it, and gave Patricia everything she had, the dates of known loans, the bit she was aware of, and asked a single question: where did the money actually go? Patricia's investigation took 6 weeks and produced a 43-page report that Renee read alone, late at night, over the course of 3 sittings because she found she could not absorb more than a portion of it at a time. The report traced, through a combination of public business filings, court records from an unrelated civil matter Daniel had been involved in years earlier that had become part of the public record, and financial patterns visible through legally accessible means, a picture of Daniel's actual financial life that bore little resemblance to the struggling entrepreneur the family had been supporting for over a decade. Daniel had, in fact, started 3 businesses. Each one had, in fact, failed. But the businesses had never been funded primarily through legitimate operating capital in the way the family believed. They had been funded, almost entirely, by family loans, and a significant portion of those loans, rather than going into business operations, had gone into Daniel's personal expenses during periods when he had told the family he was living modestly while reinvesting everything into the business. Patricia's report included documentation of a leased luxury vehicle during the coffee importing period that Daniel had described to the family as a necessary expense for client meetings, alongside records suggesting the vehicle had been used predominantly for personal travel unrelated to any documented business activity. It included a pattern of credit card spending during the fitness technology period that aligned suspiciously with vacations Daniel had described to the family as work trips related to securing partnerships. It was not, in Patricia's professional assessment delivered in the report's final section, evidence of a struggling entrepreneur who had made some poor decisions. It was evidence of a sustained and deliberate pattern of using family loans, justified through fabricated business narratives, to fund a lifestyle that none of the family members had been told about, and none of them would have funded if they had understood what they were actually funding. The second twist arrived when Renee, now in possession of Patricia's report, finally brought Marcus into full confidence, and the two of them, working together, contacted their parents to share what had been found. Their parents' reaction was not what either sibling expected. Robert and Carol Hartwell did not respond with the shock or anger that Renee and Marcus had anticipated. Instead, after a long and difficult silence in their living room, their mother said something that recontextualized the entire previous decade in a direction none of the siblings had considered. She said that she and their father had begun to suspect, roughly 4 years earlier, that something was wrong with the pattern of Daniel's requests. Not the full scope that Patricia's report now revealed, but enough of a sense of unease that they had quietly stopped lending him money directly themselves for the past 3 years. The $22,000 they had contributed, they explained, had all occurred before that point. What they had not told Renee or Marcus, because they had not wanted to alarm anyone or create family conflict based on a suspicion they could not substantiate, was that they believed Daniel had subsequently turned to other sources after they stopped lending. Specifically, they suspected, to an inheritance that had come to Daniel's wife, Lindsay, 2 years earlier following the death of Lindsay's grandmother. Lindsay had never been part of any of the family's conversations about Daniel's finances. Nobody had thought to ask her anything, because the loans had always been framed as Daniel's individual arrangements with each family member, separate from his marriage. Renee called Lindsay directly, alone, on a Tuesday afternoon, in a conversation she described afterward as one of the most difficult and most clarifying conversations of her adult life. Lindsay was not defensive. She was, instead, visibly relieved in a way that suggested she had been waiting for someone to ask her this exact question for a long time. She confirmed that she had inherited approximately $90,000 from her grandmother's estate 2 years earlier, and that the majority of it, she did not have an exact figure but believed it was at least $60,000, had gone, at Daniel's request, and with her initial belief that it was supporting his renewable energy consulting practice, into accounts and expenditures she had never been shown documentation for. She had asked Daniel for an accounting of the money on 3 separate occasions over the previous 18 months. Each time he had provided a verbal explanation and promised a written summary that had never arrived. She told Renee that she had begun, independently and without coordinating with anyone in Daniel's family, to suspect that something was deeply wrong, and that she had recently consulted a divorce attorney not because she had decided to leave the marriage, but because she wanted to understand her legal position regarding the inherited funds if the marriage did not survive what she now understood to be happening. Daniel had been running the same pattern on his own wife that he had run on his entire family for over a decade, and none of the people he had been deceiving had known about any of the others until a kitchen conversation at a birthday dinner had finally cracked the compartmentalization open. The third twist, and the one that finally moved the family from investigation to action, arrived when Patricia Nwosu, continuing her work at Renee's request after the family decided collectively that they needed full information before deciding how to proceed, uncovered the existence of a fourth business. Not the coffee importer, the fitness technology startup, or the renewable energy consulting practice. A fourth entity, registered 18 months earlier under a name none of the family had ever heard, with Daniel listed not as the founder this time, but as a silent financial partner alongside 2 other individuals Patricia was able to identify through corporate filings. This entity had not failed. It was, according to the limited public information Patricia could access, actively operating and had secured what appeared to be a legitimate round of external investment 6 months earlier. Investment that had nothing to do with any family contribution, raised entirely from sources outside the Hartwell family. Daniel had, in other words, finally built something that worked, using skills and relationships that had clearly developed over years of running businesses, however dishonestly funded those businesses had been. And he had done so while continuing to solicit and accept money from his wife under the explanation that he was still struggling, still building, still one investment away from success. He had succeeded. He had simply never told the people who had spent 11 years and over $140,000 combined, keeping him afloat through every previous failure. The family confrontation happened on a Sunday afternoon, 6 weeks after the kitchen conversation that had started everything, in their parents' living room, with all 5 family members present, Robert, Carol, Renee, Marcus, and Daniel, and Lindsay present as well, by her own request, because she had told Renee she needed to hear whatever was said directly rather than secondhand. Renee had organized the meeting and had prepared a single document, 11 pages, that laid out the complete financial timeline. Every loan, every dollar, every business, the dissolution filings, Patricia's findings about personal versus business expenditures, and the existence of the new entity that Daniel had never disclosed. She did not raise her voice when she presented it. She read through the document methodically, pausing periodically to ask Daniel directly whether he disputed any specific figure or finding. Daniel attempted, in the first several minutes, the same kind of plausible explanation that had worked for 11 years, beginning to describe market conditions and timing challenges related to the new venture, beginning to suggest that the personal expenditures Patricia had flagged had reasonable business justifications he could explain if given the chance. Nobody in the room accepted these explanations. Not because the family had become cynical or hostile, but because for the first time in 11 years, every single person in that room had the same complete information at the same time, and the explanations that had worked for a decade simply could not survive contact with a fully assembled timeline. Daniel stopped offering explanations approximately 20 minutes into the conversation. He sat in silence for a long time, and then he said, in a voice his family had never heard him use before, that he did not know how to explain it because he had stopped, several years earlier, believing his own explanations himself, and had simply continued because stopping would have required acknowledging everything at once, and he had not known how to do that. The resolution that followed was not legal in the way some family financial betrayals become legal. No one in the Hartwell family pursued criminal charges or a civil suit, a decision Renee has described as the most difficult and most carefully considered choice in the entire process, made not out of forgiveness, but out of a clear-eyed assessment that litigation would cost the family more, in money, in time, in the public exposure of private pain, than it would likely recover, given how thoroughly the funds had already been spent and dispersed across more than a decade. What did follow was a complete and permanent restructuring of the family's relationship with Daniel. Their parents, with Renee and Marcus present for the conversation, told Daniel directly that they would no longer lend him money under any circumstances, for any reason, regardless of how the request was framed, and that any future financial relationship would require complete transparency that he had demonstrated, over 11 years, he was not willing or able to provide. Lindsay filed for divorce 4 months later, a process that included a forensic accounting of the marital assets that confirmed and extended everything Patricia had found, and that resulted in Lindsay recovering a portion of her inheritance through the settlement, though not the full amount that had already been spent and could not be recovered. Daniel's relationship with his parents and siblings did not end in a single dramatic rupture. It ended the way the trust itself had been built, slowly, over the following 2 years, as invitations stopped being extended, as conversations became less frequent and then nearly non-existent, as the family that had spent 11 years extending good faith finally and permanently withdrew it. Daniel was not formally cut off. He simply, gradually, was no longer included in the ordinary fabric of family life, because the specific kind of trust that fabric requires had been spent, completely and irreversibly, the same way his family's money had been. I asked Renee, well over a year after the Sunday afternoon confrontation, what she had learned about her own family that she had not previously understood, and whether the most painful part of the experience had been Daniel's deception or something else entirely. She thought about this for a long time. She said, I think the hardest thing to accept was not that Daniel lied. People lie. I think the hardest thing was understanding how completely the compartmentalization worked, and how much of that was not Daniel's manipulation alone, but something all of us participated in without realizing it. We never asked each other directly whether we were also lending him money. We never compared notes. We each privately decided to extend trust, and we each privately decided not to make our own contribution a topic of family discussion, because doing so would have felt like keeping score, and keeping score felt ungenerous in a family that valued generosity. Daniel built his entire pattern on top of a value we were genuinely proud of. She paused. She said, I don't think we were naive. I think we were decent people who trusted each other, including trusting that nobody in this family would exploit that decency for 11 years. That trust turned out to be misplaced with one person. But I am not willing to let what Daniel did convince me that decency itself was the mistake. The mistake was not asking enough questions. The decency was never the problem. Thank you for being here on Venom Thread tonight. If something in your own family has never quite added up, if you have ever quietly wondered whether you are the only one who has been asked, or the only one who has been told a specific version of events, it might be worth comparing notes. Subscribe and hit the notification bell. New darkness next week. And we are nowhere near finished.